We are back, and we are joined now by Nick Seabrook, professor of political science at the University of North Florida, author of One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. Nick, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Of course. So, gerrymandering. You describe it as a uniquely American problem. And I do think that our audience and other progressives have a sense of that, right? Just how ridiculous this is, our redistricting process. But just how terrifyingly unique is this particular problem?
Well, it's terrifyingly unique, and also in the present political environment, uniquely bad for Democrats and progressives, at least in the context of what's happened previously in U.S. history. Not only has every other advanced democracy that uses districts for its elections figured out that the way to minimize the effects of gerrymandering is to remove politicians from the equation. There's kind of a fundamental and unavoidable conflict of interest when the same people who are going to be running for re-election in these districts are also the ones who are responsible for drawing those lines and for configuring those districts in the first place. And so every other nation has realized that you need some kind of independent entity free from political control and influence if you're going to get fair district boundaries. But it's also been the case that over the last couple of decades, the Republican Party has been particularly successful at using gerrymandering as a tool to boost its fortunes both in state elections and at the federal level as well. So we've kind of had a perfect storm of gerrymandering where we're the country that is most uniquely vulnerable to this pernicious influence on our democracy. And it's a tool that has kind of been overwhelmingly wielded by one side of the political spectrum in recent years.
And I want to get to current day in a little bit, but what I really appreciated about your book is that you go at length through the history of this concept of gerrymandering. And I love that you emphasize that gerrymandering, while toxic, was not really against or necessarily against the founding fathers' intent, because I love any opportunity to put a crack in the founders' mythology, right? Because I think it's a bit harmful to consistently return to, well, what did the founders intend, and pretend like they were divine gods in and of themselves. But some of what's so fascinating is that even if before it was called gerrymandering, this practice was a part of the way that some of the founding fathers envisioned the American political system.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the stories I focus on quite a bit in the book is how in the very first federal election that took place after the ratification of the Constitution, so the 1788 elections for Congress, less than a year after the creation of the Republic, the founding fathers were already trying to gerrymander each other out of political control. And this was all going on in the state of Virginia. And it was the culmination of a long-running, decades-long feud between several of the kind of titans of the founding era, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on one side, and Patrick Henry on the other, three of the most influential political figures in Virginia. And while Jefferson and Madison were very influential at the federal level, both at the Constitutional Convention, and of course, both subsequently became president of the United States, Henry had kind of consolidated his power within Virginia itself and had opposed the ratification of the Constitution in 1787. And so he was very much set on preventing James Madison from getting elected to Congress in that first federal election. And so he used his influence in Virginia to draw Madison into a district where he was surrounded by kind of political foes, of voters that might be hostile to him. And he recruited James Monroe to run against Madison in that election. But Patrick Henry did not have the same kind of tools and data and information available to gerrymander in 1788 that the politicians of today have access to. And his attempt was singularly unsuccessful. Madison not only won the election, but he did so in a landslide. And he went on to introduce the Bill of Rights before the first Congress after winning that election. So it's interesting to ponder how different US history might have been if Patrick Henry had been successful in one of these very early examples of American gerrymandering.
What does that look like? Is it just corralling all of the wealthy landowners into one specific district for an election? I mean, how does that manifest itself, especially when there's such a small sliver of people that have the capacity to vote at that time period?
So the actual logistics of this attempt at gerrymandering were, I think, with hindsight, somewhat ham-fisted. Obviously, this was the first election, so it's not like he could look to prior results to get any kind of sense of which areas were likely to support Madison and which were likely to oppose him. So what he did was he looked at how individual counties in Virginia had voted in the elections to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And so he felt that if a particular county had been opposed to the ratification, maybe that would be a county that would be hostile to Madison. And so he kind of pieced together a set of counties that included both Madison's home county and Monroe's home county. He cobbled them together into a district that he was kind of his best guess at one that might be hostile to Madison. And actually, subsequent analysis has suggested that there were much more effective ways that he could have gerrymandered the seat to make it difficult for Madison to win. He just didn't have the information to know that at the time.
Oh, well, now we do. And we'll get to that as well. But the term gerrymandering, as it begins to become a bit more of a practice, I did not realize it was actually, or maybe I did, and I forgot it. I think I did in college. I learned that it came from a literal guy with the last name Jerry, but it came out of Massachusetts. Talk about how that began to be a bit of a practice, starting really in the 19th century.
So gerrymandering had been going on for almost a century at this point, before we even had a word to describe the phenomenon. And much of the origin story about the term gerrymandering, I kind of found to be in many ways incorrect. And the individual who kind of often gets blamed for inventing this phenomenon, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, really was not in many ways directly involved in the creation of the district in 1812 that kind of spawned his infamy and which gave us this term. It was also the case that it was originally pronounced Gerrymander, as you might suggest from this portmanteau of the last name of Governor Gerry and the salamander that this district was said to resemble. But it was actually the state legislature in Massachusetts in 1812 that was responsible for creating this district. And Gerry had kind of signed the plan into law somewhat reluctantly, didn't really want to kind of create tension within his own political party. So he went along with this. And ultimately, this is really the one thing that he is remembered for historically, which is unfortunate because he had a long and extremely commendable political career. He was active during the Revolution. He ran weapons through his hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts, to support the Revolutionary War effort. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He later served as vice president under James Madison. And if he'd been a younger man, most likely would have been elected president in his own right. But he actually died before the conclusion of his vice presidential term. And yet today, this is kind of the one thing that we remember him for, that he lent his name to this unseemly practice of manipulating elections, with the further indignity of having his name mispronounced in the modern term gerrymander.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, that is unfortunate, but it is also interesting too. You mentioned the revolution, so it reminded me how this practice also was kind of stolen from the House of Commons as well. Talk about the roots of this redistricting, finagling coming from the England itself.
So kind of delving even further back into the history of gerrymandering, I went back first into the colonial era, where I found that a number of British colonial officials were engaging in gerrymandering when it came to the districts that were drawn to elect the colonial legislature. And most often this was used to boost their own power and authority, and to reduce the influence that the colonists, their constituents themselves, had on the politics of the colonial period. So it was kind of a tool for the British Crown to use to exert control over the Americas. But going even further back into the mists of British history, really from the very creation of the House of Commons in the wake of the Magna Carta, and the very first constituencies that were used for electing members of the British Parliament, there has been shenanigans that have been going on in terms of the drawing of those districts. And in particular, there was a long tradition in British political history of something called a rotten borough, which in essence was a system whereby the noblemen of the time, even with this veneer of democracy in the form of the House of Commons, were able to corruptly maintain their influence over the workings of Parliament. And they did so by drawing districts so that only sometimes as few as a handful of individual voters were responsible for electing members of Parliament. And they were thus able to corruptly influence both the voters and the MPs themselves through bribery or patronage. And even as late as the 19th century, there were members of the House of Commons that were elected by as few as 50 to 100 individuals. So this was kind of the early forerunner of the American gerrymandering that we see today.
So how did that kind of get curbed in Britain and not in the United States? Was it because of political revolution? I know maybe this is a bit of a turn away from U.S. history, but I'm just curious.
So there were a couple of significant pieces of legislation that were passed in Great Britain during the mid to late 19th century. One of those was the Representation of the People Act, which ended this practice of having members of parliament elected from these kind of small, sparsely populated districts. And then later on, the UK created what are called boundaries commissions. In essence, they turned the control over the drawing of districts for the House of Commons to an independent commission that was kind of insulated from the influence of politicians themselves. And this is the approach that spread first throughout the British Commonwealth and then later into basically every other nation that uses districts for its elections, that you have some kind of independent commission or some kind of independent government agency that is responsible for drawing districts in order to ensure that the elected politicians are not able to meddle in that process.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, there can be some lessons potentially gleaned from that when we talk about reform. But just one more thing about some of the earlier history, because I liked the way that you framed what Lincoln did in terms of this isn't technically gerrymandering, but it is an example that these kinds of machinations have happened throughout history in terms of how Lincoln essentially was granting statehood during that time, and that was a way to solidify power as well. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I define gerrymandering fairly broadly in the book as any circumstance in which political boundaries are manipulated for some kind of partisan or political purpose. mostly because I wanted to be able to talk about the stuff that Lincoln and some of the other Republicans were doing in the mid to late 19th century. And one of the major issues in Washington, both before, during, and after the Civil War, was the question of when U.S. territories would become states in their own right, and on what terms those statehoods would proceed. And prior to the Civil War, there was kind of this rule of thumb that was used for creating new states, under which a state, or a territory as it was at the time, would only be considered for admission once its population had grown large enough that it would be entitled to one seat in the House of Representatives. But once the Civil War broke out, and once the question of how new states would be admitted and on what terms, and the political benefits that this could potentially bring Lincoln in his re-election bid came to the forefront, that rule of thumb was pretty much jettisoned, as was any semblance of adhering some of these new statehood admissions to the Constitution.
I'd say good, right? I mean, that's an example of kind of these rules being, I guess, used for the better side, which I feel like it seldom happens.
Yeah, and a lot of the historians who have analyzed this kind of recognize, as many did at the time, that that this probably went against the Constitution, certainly with the admission of West Virginia during the Civil War, which had itself seceded from Virginia, which had seceded from the United States, but also with the admission of Nevada as well, which had only a few thousand residents at the time that Lincoln and the radical Republicans kind of brought it into the Union. It was probably justified at that point. But once we move into the late 19th century, what we see is that Lincoln's successors in the Republican Party kind of used this same playbook to add a whole bunch of other new states. And probably the most egregious of these was splitting the Dakota Territory into two independent units, North Dakota and South Dakota, and then immediately admitting both of them as new states. And so the incentive was that if you do it that way, instead of getting 2 new Republican senators, you get 4 Republican senators. And instead of getting 3 electoral college votes, you get 6 electoral college votes for the Republican Party. And so the statehood shenanigans considered well into the 1880s, even as the expediency of the Civil War and Reconstruction as a justification were no longer really on the table.
Well, and then we live with that today, where in the prior Congress, we had 50 Democratic senators and 50 Republican senators, and the Democrats represent 40 million more people, really, because of the way that that was so aggressively pursued, even which is unfortunately undemocratic. But let's then move into the 20th century, because this is really when this process begins to ramp up, and there were some efforts by the courts to curb it, but they were largely unsuccessful, is my understanding. How did the courts try to approach gerrymandering as a practice, and what's your sense of how they were able to restrain it, if at all?
So the courts largely stayed out of debates about the drawing of legislative districts until the 1960s. And what ultimately prompted their involvement was the phenomenon known as malapportionment. And malapportionment essentially is a similar kind of idea to the rotten boroughs in the UK that I talked about earlier. You have a situation where districts in the same state, in the same legislature, have dramatically different populations from one another. And what happened over the first half of the 20th century is that America's urban centers grew significantly in terms of their population, but their representation in state legislatures and in Congress was not increased commensurate with the growth in their numbers. And so by the 1960s, America's cities were significantly underrepresented in both state and federal governments. and rural areas were overrepresented. And of course, the rural representatives who were benefiting from this resisted any attempt to try and reform things democratically because they were still reaping the benefits of this imbalance in terms of numbers. And so it wasn't until the 1960s where a series of Supreme Court decisions created this principle called one person, one vote, after which the book itself is named, which to this day mandates that all of the districts within a legislative chamber have to have equal populations to one another. And while this was obviously a very positive development for democracy, it also kind of served to put gerrymandering on steroids to an extent, because now every single state would have to redraw every single one of its districts every 10 years after a new census in order to maintain compliance with this one person, one vote principle. And so redistricting and gerrymandering became not just something that happened whenever politicians had a particular inclination to do it, but something that came about much more frequently now that redistricting is happening all the time, every 10 years. And this is sort of what I refer to as the modern era of gerrymandering, where something that had been ubiquitous but infrequent became an everyday occurrence across the nation.
And also incredibly racialized too, in terms of what it being on steroids by that point. How, in terms of looking at the maps post this decision, post this weigh-in by the court, how much more did that accelerate the racial divisions in some of these gerrymandered districts?
It certainly was a major component of the ways in which particularly southern state legislatures, which had previously been able to suppress the influence of minority populations through overt disenfranchisement. But with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the more aggressive enforcement by the federal government of the 15th Amendment, suddenly those traditional tools of disenfranchisement were no longer available. And the registration rates of Black voters across the South began to surge. And so what these state legislatures realized is that gerrymandering was a potent new tool that they could now use to ensure that these newly enfranchised Black populations would still not be able to have a significant influence on government. And so they used some of the very same gerrymandering techniques that today get used by Republicans to disadvantage Democrats to ensure that that Black voters did not have a voice in state government. And it took another couple of decades of litigation. It took amendments by Congress to the Voting Rights Act in the 1980s for the problem of racial vote dilution that emerged after the Civil Rights Movement to really be effectively addressed.
Well, good thing, none of that has been touched by the courts or anything like that, right?
Yeah, luckily that problem was solved and we never have to worry about it again. There certainly hasn't been any backsliding there.
In all seriousness, though, I mean, the recent rollbacks by the kind of extremist right-wing Supreme Court, now we're in more modern times. I mean, how has that affected gerrymandering efforts? I know at the same time, some Democrats are being more aggressive on that front, gerrymandering themselves in certain states once they've gotten control of state legislatures. But that obviously is only a temporary hole plug.
Yeah, so almost as soon as the decisions of the 1980s and the legislation I talked about had really provided strong legal remedies for racial vote dilution, the emerging conservative majority on the Supreme Court began to undermine those, beginning with a series of cases in the 1990s where they limited the ability of states to draw majority-minority districts, so districts that were drawn primarily to allow previously disadvantaged and marginalized populations to have an effective voice in government. And then more recently, and there is a case pending at the Supreme Court right now called Merrill versus Milligan, we've seen the court start to further undermine the progress that was made by the Voting Rights Act. And so this was a case that came out of Alabama. Alabama, which has a Black population of around about 27, 28%, drew just one of its 7 U.S. House districts in a way that would allow Black voters to elect representatives of their choice. And the lower court said that was a violation of the VRA. You have to go back and draw a second Black influence district in order to be in compliance. And the Supreme Court stayed that ruling. They allowed the plan to go into effect. And when this case ultimately gets decided, probably in June or July of this year, it's going to further weaken those Voting Rights Act protections that minority voters have relied on in order to increase their representation in both Congress and state legislatures over the last few decades.
Expand a bit more on that, why that's so harmful in particular to just have one Black district, because, you know, it is less percentage-wise than the percentage of the Black population in the state, but it's more than that, right? It's more than just that difference in percentage. It's the fact that these voters are being cobbled into one district so that no one else is threatened, and that you kind of have somebody on an island representing Black voters as opposed to having their influence be more spread out.
Right, and so what the GOP did in Alabama was to pack a large number of Black voters into this one congressional district. But then they also divided the rest of the African American populations in the state among as many districts as possible. And so this ensures, firstly, that this one seat is always going to elect an African American to Congress, but it essentially ensures that Black voters elsewhere are not able to have any effective influence on the results. And this is kind of the logic of racial vote dilution, that if you submerge marginalized voters in a significant enough population of white voters, and when you have racially polarized voting present, when white Americans tend to vote for different candidates from Black Americans or Americans of other groups, it has the effect of shutting out that population from political influence entirely. And this was the technique that was used after the civil rights movement to undermine the influence of newly enfranchised Black voters. And if we see this case get decided in favor of Alabama, that's going to enable and embolden states to kind of backslide and start using those tactics much more significantly than they have been allowed to in recent years. Lastly,
that is the state of the fights on the Supreme Court level. But in terms of other reforms, what's your sense of where we are at right now at the start of 2023?
So I tried to make this a book that was not entirely pessimistic, although obviously there are a lot of reasons for concern about the health of American democracy and the threats to that come not just from gerrymandering, but from election subversion, from voter suppression, and from a whole host of other anti-democratic sentiments as well. But the note of optimism that I tried to conclude the book with is that we have made some significant progress at the state level, particularly over the last decade or so. And overwhelmingly, when the American people are given the opportunity to weigh in on this question, either through surveys or through the opportunity to vote for an initiative, a constitutional amendment in their state, Democrats, Republicans, Independents all say and all vote to get rid of gerrymandering. We have seen initiatives that reform the redistricting process to reduce gerrymandering passed in states as diverse as Florida, Michigan, California, and Utah. We have seen a number of states successfully use both lawsuits in state Supreme Courts and the citizens' initiative process to address partisan gerrymandering in their respective jurisdictions. And there are a lot of people working to try and fix this problem. The good thing is that we know what we have to do. We know what the solution is. The solution is simply to take this power away from politicians and insulate it from political influence. That for many, many decades now, we've had a system where the voters don't get to pick their politicians. The politicians get to pick their voters. And I'm optimistic because every time the American people get to vote on this, they seem to vote the right way. The question is just giving them that opportunity, putting in the groundwork to get measures on the ballot that allow for redistricting reform to happen.
Nick Seabrook, the book is called One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. Nick, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.